All right, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Rachel Weston. I'm the Events and Communications Specialist here at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to another event in our data scraping series. Today's discussion is titled Desirable Inefficiency in Data Scraping, the Role of Friction in Privacy. And we're thrilled to be joined by Paul Ohm in conversation with UC Berkeley's very own Tejas Narachania. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump in. It is my pleasure to introduce Anne Cleveland, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and she's going to provide some brief opening remarks before introducing today's discussants. Anne, take it away.
Thanks, Rachel. Hello, everybody, and welcome. It's great to see so many of you in the audience today. Thanks for joining us. Today's event is part of CLTC's mission to focus on the future of digital security and expand who participates in cybersecurity. Today's conversation is the fourth in a series we've been convening this year on different facets of data scraping as the evolution of technology forces us to reconsider questions about what is public and what is private. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished moderator and panelists today. And after that, we'll get off and running. So our moderator, Tejas Narachania, is the Robert and Nancy Corson Assistant Professor of Law at Berkeley Law. His work focuses on telecommunications regulation and intellectual property, among other subjects. He is also a faculty co-director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology. Before joining Berkeley Law, Professor Narachania clerked for Justice Stephen G. Breyer of the Supreme Court and for Judge Diane P. Wood of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. He has a JD from Columbia Law School and is also a Berkeley alum with a BS in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science and a BA in Political Science. And we're so grateful to our panelist, Paul Ohm, for being here. Paul is a professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. In his research, service, and teaching, Professor Ohm builds bridges between computer science and law, utilizing his training and experience as a lawyer, policymaker, computer programmer, and network systems administrator. Professor Ohm serves as the inaugural chair of the Georgetown University Tech and Society Initiative, as well as a faculty director for the Institute of Technology Law and Policy and the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law. He started his legal career as a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Department of Justice's legendary Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section, where he worked on cutting-edge issues around the Fourth Amendment, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and Electronic Communications Privacy Act. So we're so excited about this conversation today. And with that, Tejas, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Anne, so much for those great introductions. And thanks especially to you, Paul, for agreeing to join us. It's a real treat to get to talk to you for the next hour or so, and I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to start, as I usually do for anybody who's new to this series, with a brief word on just data scraping and what data scraping is. And then, Paul, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Different courts have thought about, and I'm looking at this through the judicial lens because I'm a law professor, and so different courts have thought about what data scraping is in slightly different terms. The district court in the District of Minnesota has referred to data scraping as quite simply pulling information off a website and compiling it. The Ninth Circuit, the appeals court with responsibility for a number of states, including California, has given us a slightly more detailed definition, suggesting that scraping involves extracting data from a website, copying into a structured format, allowing for data manipulation and analysis, and noting especially that scraping can be done both manually, but more frequently and more efficiently done by a bot. I guess one question that I want to start out with, Paul, is how has scraping changed the way we think about digital system design, and maybe relatedly, sort of like how has scraping made things, or bot-based scraping or automated scraping made things more efficient? And do we want things to be less efficient?
Yeah, thank you, Tejas, and thanks to Rachel and Ann and everyone at the center for hosting me. I have spent my entire career, I'm sort of a professional web scraper. So I've been scraping the web for as long as there has been the web. I'm that old. And I've trained more than a generation of law students on how to use some rudimentary computer skills. And part of that has been how to scrape a website in Python. And one thing that kind of your question sparks in me is scraping is very much an arms race between the people who are publishing this information and the people who are scraping the information. And as you say, one thing that I'm intrigued to explore over this hour and in my work going forward is how counterintuitive it kind of fundamentally is that we have these arms races that are spinning off inefficient technologies. And the reason I call that counterintuitive is, you were an undergrad in computer science, as was I. And the very first thing you learn in computer science education is you've got to make your code more efficient. And if you look at kind of undergraduate training around the country, there's a class called algorithms. And algorithms is really the study of code and efficiency. And for those in the know, we talk about big O notation and little o notation. But the bottom line is, as we scale systems to be larger and to include more data, how can we keep things computationally feasible? How can we make sure that we can process things at ever large scale? And I had a graduate student once named Jonathan Frankel. I think it's important to name him by name because he's now a machine learning expert of some note. But when Jonathan and I got together about 6 or 7 years ago, in one of our first meetings, we put the Bitcoin proof of work algorithm on the board and we said, how does this make sense? Like, this is such a wasteful process that's now replicated, millions of times around the world, and now today, probably hundreds of millions of times. And the fact that Bitcoin at its heart has an inefficient piece is now really well known because we talk about the environmental impact of cryptocurrency. But 7 years ago, this was still kind of a new idea. And so together we wrote an article, and that's sort of the heart of why we decided to frame this hour the way we have, called Desirable Inefficiency. It's in the Florida Law Review. And we really started to explore why computer scientists would bake something into a system that's slow. And the most interesting thing for me about that project is we started to see it everywhere. So that article really is a catalog of 9 examples where really important systems you have heard of have a slowing mechanism or an illogically convoluted spatial algorithm for reasons that you wouldn't expect if you were in that undergraduate computer science classroom. And it's led me on this long path thinking about desirable inefficiency, not only for that paper, but in my current work as well.
So that's a great teaser. And I'm just going to I want to keep hearing from you. So tell me a little bit about these 9 systems. Tell me a little bit about why programmers bake inefficient, like what problems are they trying to solve with less efficient system design?
Yeah, and here's what I love most about it, and this is why I think it connects so deeply with privacy, which is kind of the core of my work. So this is probably painting with too broad a brush, but our thesis, and I think we've given a lot of evidence, is that it's when a programmer is asked to inject some sort of human value that typically they're not coding for, right? So we code for speed all the time. We code to make sure that things work on slower processors all the time. We, in the olden days, used to code for hard disk scarcity because hard disks were expensive. They're not so expensive anymore. But those types of things we know what to do, and it's why undergraduate education focuses on efficiency. But when there's another human value, and the list is as long as philosophy classes in colleges, that's when you might expect to see desirable inefficiency as a solution. So my favorite example, and it's the one I have at the heart of the paper, is IEX. IEX is one of the kind of 13 recognized stock exchanges. IEX was made famous by Michael Lewis's book, Flash Boys. I have to give a caveat. What I don't understand about stock trading and high-speed trading outstrips what I do know. But what IEX did was they said, flash traders, people who have kind of privileged access to the network because they spend a lot of money to be in the right rack, in the right server room, in the right basement in New Jersey, they are able to step inside or in the middle of trades at a rate that is not only inhuman, but faster than all the other computers by all the other companies. And through that, they can use arbitrage, and they can engage in an activity called front running. And the details aren't terribly important, and the details change every year. But IEX deemed that that was unfair, that there was this human value fairness. It's not the kind of thing we code for a lot, but that fairness was something they wanted to restore. One of the things I love most about this example is that the high-speed flash traders, they said, you've got this completely backwards. Like, I have paid for high-speed access in this basement. You're the one who's acting unfair if you design a desirably inefficient system to lock us out. And honestly, for purposes of this project, I don't care who's right or wrong. I think that's what happens with human values. Like, we bring values to the table and then we disagree. But the most interesting thing about IEX is the way they implemented their solution is they literally took a shoebox-sized metal box, and then they wrapped 38 miles of fiber optic cable inside that box. And to trade on IEX, every single photon of information, packet of information, has to travel the 38 miles, and it slows down the trade by 350 microseconds, which they deemed to be exactly the right amount of time to make sure that trading is still efficient, but that these high-speed traders no longer have their unfair advantage. So that's one of the 9 examples, but I'm so intrigued by this phenomenon.
I have one question, one substantive question that I want to ask you. But before that, I have a really small question, which is, do you know how much 38 miles of glass costs?
I don't know. I mean, it's a very compact box, and I live in DC. I want to like take the train up to New Jersey and ask if I can touch it, since I've written about it so long. But yeah, I don't think this was a wildly expensive thing, to be honest.
Okay.
It's a surprisingly compact little device.
Yeah, I mean, I should know more about how much a mile of fiber costs, but now I have an incentive to go look that up. Okay, so here's my more substantive question.
Yeah.
So you said, you don't really care about whether IEX is right or whether the traders are right. It's sort of what's fair here. But I do kind of care, right? I care like who's right on which outcome is fairness, and I think even more than that, I care about who gets to decide what's fair.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about, I think what's interesting about the solutions or the systems that you're talking about is that the control over the competition among human values rests with programmers.
Right.
Maybe I'll just let you react to that, and then I want to ask a little bit about how that interacts with democracy and law.
Yeah, no, and to be clear, you are preaching to the choir. So when Rachel introduced me and she had that ridiculous alphabet soup of titles I own, because honestly, I just like to go to my dean and say, can we call me this today? The one that I think is at the heart of your question is I run something called the Tech and Society Initiative, and that name is quite intentional. We think you're not doing your job right, for the most part, if you're thinking about tech without the society. If you're not only thinking about human values, not only having an opinion about who's right or wrong in values-laden conflicts, but then also, as you suggest in your question, thinking about the governance structures and the power and the way power gets distributed in all sorts of kind of aberrational ways. And so I'm right there with you. The only reason I don't have a dog in the fight with IEX, well, partly it's because I'm just not enough of an expert. But it's also because for purposes of this project, the fact that there's a fight over values is where I'm stopping my analysis. But yeah, when it comes to privacy, surveillance, everything else, I, if anything, am probably a little too opinionated for a dispassionate scholar. But to the second half of your question, absolutely, I do not want to come across as saying programmers have the control, they deserve the control, they're entitled to the control. The natural evolution of things gave programmers the control because they were the most worthy. And in fact, as we put this article together, we were careful to say repeatedly, this is step 1 in a longer project. And so step 1 is, hey, this really interesting thing with inefficiency is starting to happen spontaneously. It's starting to happen from the technologists themselves. But where this project ends and probably gets to pretty quickly is governance, right? So now that we know we can sprinkle, and so the word I haven't said yet today, but it's in the title of our talk, friction, into the right place in the system, is something that companies do, individual programmers do, outside hackers do, data scrapers do, and ultimately I think governments and other civil society organizations, we should at least have a say in where that friction goes. But to understand it, we kind of have to understand how this friction works and where it comes from, which is why step one was, let's look at it in the wild.
And that seems right to me. I guess maybe I'll try to. So first, before I transition us to maybe talking about these meta systems of governance, the governance systems that govern these systems, a quick reminder to the audience that I am going to try to save some time for your questions towards the end, probably starting in about 10 minutes. So if you have questions, please throw them into the Q&A. I will go through those and some of the questions that some of you submitted earlier on. But let me ask you, let me start by asking you this question, which is, how should we then, totally agree that we need to spend some time understanding the technical systems themselves, that we can't effectively govern them if we don't understand them, if we don't have at least a good understanding of how they function and where there's intentional friction, where that friction might be removed, and why developers are putting it in. But then how do we design the systems how do we design the governance systems that help us resolve the competition among human values in a way that's not simply let the programmer decide? So you referred to civil society should have a say, people should have a say, companies should have a say too. What does that look like on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, one way of reframing that question is like, what's my political theory, or like, what's the essence of my and I'm not a political theorist, but I think one thing that's interesting for legal scholars like you and me who start with a technical background is we can be a little less timid about proposing things that in some circles would be considered impolite, right? And so one thing that I think a lot about is how right now there really is this monopoly on design, and that the programmers have it, and fundamentally at the end of the day, a few founders of a few companies really have a kind of disproportionate vote, if we want to put it in democratic terms, into the systems that govern our elections and govern our speech fora. And so if there's a common thread to my work, it's we need to be able to recognize that that there is another way, and that given the kind of democratic society we happen to live in, there are avenues, there are statutes we can write, there are rules we can write, and they may fundamentally shift what those technologists do or do not do. They may do it through like incentives and nudges, and they may do it through good old-fashioned command and control diktats that say you have to put friction here, you cannot put friction there. And so unless we have a very concrete specific topic, it's harder for me to go deeper than that. But I think I really want to be known as one who's willing to kind of broaden the design table, to put a bunch of people at that table, because right now it's just a few people. It's a lonely little dinner party, and we should expand that.
Yeah, it is, and I think that. I'm not necessarily associating you with all the critiques of big tech, but I think it is one of the critiques of our large technology companies, which is they control many of these systems, and they are so important to our lives that we feel that perhaps more democratic control over the ways that they function would be better for society. Maybe I'll ask a related but slightly different question, which is, rather than about the governance systems that you think we should have, what do you make of the ones that we do have? So, like, for example, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or the CCPA. Maybe I'll just invite you to say maybe a little bit about how those laws maybe have had the effect that you've envisioned, sort of changing the way that programmers or companies address system design, and whether you think they've been good or bad on balance.
Yeah. And here it's good that I was gifted with a very large cranium, because I wear so many hats. I've been a public official 3 times, so I have a kind of very public official inflected response to a question like that. So I started my career looking for hackers so we could prosecute them under the CFAA. I took a year off to go to the Federal Trade Commission, and I helped them write a bunch of privacy regulations and worked on some cases. And then I am now actually moonlighting part-time with the Colorado Attorney General's office. I'm not speaking on their behalf. None of these reflect the opinions of the Colorado Attorney General, but they're writing privacy rules, and Colorado, in a very stealthy way, has a statute very much inspired by the CCPA, and I'm part of the team writing it. So call me biased if you want, but I am a real believer not only in the power of government to kind of thoughtfully engage with the way tech is designed and evolves. I actually am probably more of a defender of our current toolkit than your average law professor in our field, right? So I'm not one to say the CFAA is a mess and ECPA makes no sense and the CCPA is, a drop in the bucket, although I've certainly heard friends and colleagues say all three of those things. None of them perfect, right? It's hard to write text that reflects the current technical reality. It's harder to keep text relevant with kind of the seismic changes we've seen. I'm a big believer in kind of delayed governance, where we set up first principles in something like the CCPA. CCPA is actually pretty specific, but then we trust a regulatory body, an expert agency, to kind of lend meaning to that, either through rulemaking or through enforcement decisions. I'm also similarly a big believer in the strength of our federal judiciary to really tease out super hard technical questions, so long as the kind of litigators are doing their jobs. And so giving them open textured language in the CFAA or ECPA can lead to good results. And again, I'm not here to say all three of those are perfect statutes, but I think I'm more of a defender of them and believer in them. And more importantly, would love to see creative thinking that goes beyond where any of the three have gone, that really do, I use the word impolite already, like disrupt the polite, arm's length way we tend to think about deference to the tech industry.
I'm having trouble coming up with questions to push you and challenge you, because I agree with all of that. I'm in the exact same camp, right? I think that these legislative efforts, like most legislative efforts, are good but not perfect. And I am also a big believer in having our legislatures set basic ground rules and letting those evolve and develop over time through skilled and politically accountable regulators and in the courts. And I think all of that is a sort of nice reflection of the way our system is supposed to work. And
by the way, you and I are both saying this after a 4-year, test of our faith in that, right?
Absolutely, right. And I like, yeah, I agree that elections have consequences. Yeah. That it is important to vote, and that political accountability has to cut both ways.
Yeah. I mean, the key thing I want people to hear, and I'm sort of repeating myself, but I want to highlight this, is that there are a lot of pieces of conventional wisdom you hear all the time about regulating tech that just, I think, are fundamentally flawed, which is, judges can't keep up with changing technology. You hear that all the time in patent disputes, but you also hear that when it comes to something like the CFAA. You will often hear, Congress people are too old to understand technology. They don't have, the same technology we deal with. And that's kind of an empirically true fact, but I don't think what follows from that is that they're unable to kind of take a career of thinking about how to regulate industries and then apply it there. And then, following your lead, maybe let me try and say things that you do disagree with. I think I have it in me, maybe not. I have this small paper, we didn't even talk about it in the prep to this panel. In the small paper I wrote with Georgetown student Nate Kim, we gain inspiration from the right to repair movement. And this is very much in the friction theme. So this is still within theme. We argue that every smart home device should just have a kill switch that restores its operation as a plain old thermostat or a plain old fridge, and that there should be an affirmative statutory obligation for every maybe large smart home manufacturer in the US or who want to sell in the US to build in a switch like that. And it will be expensive and it will be inefficient, and the price of these devices may go up a little, although I bet not too much. And honestly, I'm not even sure it's going to be used by many consumers, but I believe that encouraging lawmakers to be proactive in the design of technical systems is so important that that's a step in the right direction, just like the right to repair is as well.
Yeah, again, I don't think I disagree with you.
Man, I thought I had you. Okay.
No, and so some of this is informed by, I mean, you may have seen this horror story over the past, I want to say that this last weekend, although maybe it's a little bit before that, these biometric implants that they were bricked. You know, people lost their vision. It just walking down the street. And I think that is, we do need our legislators and legislatures to be thinking more proactively about what do we want, what sorts of long-term responsibilities do we want to put on the manufacturers of connected devices, whether they are smart home devices or biometric implants or anything else. So yeah, sorry, I still not disagreeing, but maybe I should try to jump over to some of the audience questions because they're starting to come in both live and we have a few of these pre-submitted questions. I'm going to start with one of the ones that we got in advance of our conversation. And so this is a question about encryption. And it's basically, the question asks, does encryption work against scraping? What emerging methods and patterns can protect public data against data scraping? So that's the question, but maybe you want to talk a little bit just generally about the role of encryption in both scraping and friction generally.
Yeah, and I haven't, because we've been having this fascinating conversation about kind of high political theory, let me say a little bit more about friction. And when I say friction, I really mean this in a kind of capacious way. Friction takes a lot of forms. And whenever we start talking about, we say picture a speed bump, right? A speed bump doesn't stop a car from passing through, it just limits the speed for lots of purposes. And so I think there are a lot of technological equivalents. One that's related to encryption was made famous in the FBI Apple fight from a few years back, which is every time you fat finger your password on your iPhone, it delays a little bit longer than it delayed before, according to some set standard that was tuned by the Apple engineers, right? This friction's super highly studied and designed. And at least the default at the time of the FBI Apple table that talked about these delays, the delays got really, really long after like 5 false guesses. And then at least on some versions of iOS, once you got to 9 or 10, I believe, it basically locked you out of the phone. And depending on how you had the settings, it might even brick your phone or delete all the content from your phone, right? And so here's friction. Here's really kind of highly designed friction. The human values I talked about kind of are everywhere, right? This is about government surveillance. This is about identity theft. This is about trust. This is about security. These are all these kind of values-laden words that the Apple engineers decided to use through encryption and through an encryption unlocking kind of scenario. And so encryption is really interesting because encryption we often think of as like a binary, right? You either have the passcode and you get in or you don't. But encryption, if you sprinkle it in the right places, like in the Apple example, could actually just be more like a speed bump, right? I mean, there's this really interesting example. The problem is some of these examples are just like interesting only in theory, but haven't really come to be. So there's, in the middle of the crypto wars, right? The fight over should we have backdoored encryption protocols. Someone wrote this really intriguing paper, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name, I can't credit you, called privacy crumple zones. And the idea was you would have encryption that was kind of, robust, military grade, whatever adjective you want to have on it. But that if you had the right kind of key, that encryption would be crackable, but only at great expense. So you could brute force it at the expense of like $1 million. So one thing that was so cool about that paper was they did it in terms of dollars and cents, not number of years it would take a Pentium processor to attack it. And so again, I think there are a lot of people in the crypto wars who find that deeply offensive that we would try and dumb down encryption in that way. I thought it was such an interesting way to try and have a tuning dial that is democratically set that would allow the encryption to work, except when it didn't because some judge signed some warrant that produced some key. I could go on and on, but the relationship between friction and encryption is super interesting, and there's a lot there.
That is really interesting. Do you want to go on? We have a little bit of time.
I mean, because some of your crowd came for data scraping, and we haven't talked much about data scraping, right? And I did say data scraping is something that I've spent a lot of time doing, and I've run into what I would deem friction responses to data scraping. So this is before you get to legal remedies. This is just trying to make it easier to detect that the person who is acting is not the kind of person you want on your website, and then 2, doing something to slow them down. And so one of the classic ones, and it comes up a lot in the jurisprudence, is MAC address filtering. So for those in the audience who may not know, your MAC address is a kind of not quite immutable, but an identifier that's associated with the NIC, the network interface card in your computer. And so it's a little bit more like a fingerprint, a unique ID, than an IP address, which could be shared with different devices. And so there have been cases where MAC addresses are visible to the person being scraped. They aren't always, but if it's just right, they might be. They know that you are scraping. They could tell just by the volume of your activity. And so they block that MAC address. And again, that might feel like it's not friction. That's just like security. But the thing about a MAC address is, even though they're sort of immutable, they actually can be changed. And you don't have to be that sophisticated to change them. And so it's a kind of a roadblock or a speed bump, but one that a technically sophisticated data scraper can probably get around. This is actually at the heart of one of the most tragic stories in all of data scraping history, which is the Aaron Schwartz example. So Schwartz, you'll recall, was scraping a archive of scholarly literature from a closet, I want to make sure I get the schools right, at MIT. And what MIT did on this kind of long road to trying to figure out who this was and stop him is they implemented MAC address filtering. And so we can get into like, what does the law say about that? But before we even get to the law, that's friction. That's friction, and it's not a perfect block, but it's a decent block. If Aaron Schwartz wasn't quite as technically sophisticated, and by the way, I said tragic because he committed suicide, which is the ending of that terrible story before the prosecution finished its case. If it was someone less sophisticated, that might have been a roadblock. That might have been more than a speed bump. For Aaron Schwartz, it was just a speed bump. So what do we make of that in terms of the IT security side of things? And what do we make of that in terms of the legal remedy side of things, the morality side of things? It's a really, a place where all of these issues come together.
Yeah, the Schwartz story is a particularly tragic one. And I think sort of against the backdrop of OSTP's actions this last week, it's sort of, the view that much of this content should be public and made available, which is what he was trying to do, seems to have ultimately been vindicated, but at significant personal and human cost. Okay, Brandy asks, Brandy Nanaki, also here at Berkeley, she asks an interesting question, which I think is related to the arms race that you identified, the sort of arms race between scrapers and scrapees, if you will. So she asks, how do you balance scraping? And I think also implicit in that is sort of the benefits of what you can do with the data once you've scraped it, the sort of analysis, like what you can learn from data that you can scrape, with obligations in data privacy that end users have. So again, I think this comes to the sort of conflict of values. How should we balance those, the scraping versus privacy, the learning of scraping versus privacy, and the arms race of the scrapers and the scrapees?
Yeah, so let's tackle the core question, and then I'll try and apply it to the arms race and to friction. So how much has Clearview come up in this series? Has that been discussed in the prior case?
We have, I don't remember if we've talked about maybe a little bit, but let's talk about Clearview.
Clearview is such a fascinating Rorschach test, right? And it really does put all of those issues that Brandy was just asking about front and center. So Clearview, of course, is the company that scraped social media. And so arguably it complicates the privacy story because these were images that were sort of public in the way that social media is sort of public. And then they just used it as a massive training data set to create a really, at least according to their marketing, effective facial recognition system. And then they've kind of compounded the alarm by flip-flopping their business model a few times. At one point it was, we'll sell this to anyone. And then later it was, no, we're only going to sell this to the governments of the world, as if that made it better. And I don't actually know what their current business model is. I think they're still a going venture. And you know, one way to respond to the Clearview story is to make it just a data scraping story. That either the original sin or the best place where we could have stopped it is once we realized that this bot army was downloading not thousands, but hundreds of millions of images. And it was pre-labeled, right? This is so really good for the machine learning piece of this. And I find that, I won't pretend like I've surveyed all my friends on Clearview, but I find that every time it comes up, it's really hard to predict the person in front of you and how they would respond to it. I think most often I've heard people say it's not a scraping story at all. It's a machine learning and ethical business model story. I think it's a scraping story too, right? I think that had we realized that it was the same company who, you know, without permission, I don't think they were getting user consent, was downloading all of these images, right? At that moment, so to kind of highlight Brandy's question, in the balance scale, my sense of imminent possible privacy violation would begin to at least out-tip whatever research benefit this company or entity was hoping to achieve. And especially because of the scale we're talking about, hundreds of millions. So here's where friction could come in, right? So what if, and I'm not gonna give you an exact technology, let's just make a sci-fi technology. What if there's a sci-fi technology that said if you scrape a few photos, there's no friction imposed whatsoever? If you scrape 100, maybe we like require the processor on your computer to work a little bit harder for each one after 100. And then once you get to 10,000, you're like forced to do some sort of Bitcoin style proof of work math puzzle to get the next photo. Again, pretty far-fetched. There'd be arms races all the way down. Like my system would be kind of hard to implement. But if you could implement it, friction might separate and I'm going to just use crude language, maybe to spark disagreement from you or the questioners, the good researchers from the bad researchers, right? Good meaning consistent with privacy, you know, considerations and the value of this research versus not. It's going to be crude. You're going to make mistakes. There'll be false positives and false negatives. But what I love is there's a mechanism that might make the possible sorting, you know, what seems impossible now possible, and which is why I think it might be a scraping story, not just a ethical business model story.
Okay, you finally provoked some disagreement from me. So I'm going to react, I think, quickly to two things in there. So first, do I think Clearview is a scraping story? I hear you. There's scraping is important and is part of the story. I am less sure that Clearview is a scraping story more than it is a sort of ethical business practices story. And the reason I say that is because, yeah, Clearview scraped all these photos from social media, but what's ultimately problematic is what it did with it. Like if Clearview told me that its business model was, we're going to do audit testing on all these other facial recognition systems, and we're doing this to measure gender and racial bias in existing facial recognition systems and serve that to law enforcement, I'm not sure how many people would have complained or cared. Right. So that's the first little bit of disagreement. I think it's less about the scraping and more about to what end, scraping to what end. And then on the proof of work, so that's interesting. And I like the idea of being able to separate the good researchers from the bad researchers. My worry is that a system of the sort you have described, and you can tell me why I'm wrong about this, isn't going to separate good from bad. It will separate resourced from not resourced. Right. And I'm not sure that those are correlated.
No, that's in fact, the more I think about friction, the more I run into that very, very, very important objection. Even the crumple zone encryption we just talked about, right? So $1 million is nothing to the FBI, and $1 million is nothing to kind of some nefarious, you know, semi-wealthy, you don't even have to be a billionaire tech person. So maybe we are just saying the law school clinics of the world can't do this, but anyone associated with a major company can. So yes, I have to keep that in view. I mean, I think the reason why I'm not ready to give up on scraping as part of the story is because I am a privacy scholar, and fundamentally, right, the fact that these photos are available to scrapers is both a huge part of the problem. Now, Clearview didn't cause that problem. Facebook did. Clearview just benefited from that problem. But it's also, there is this tendency, and I'm not accusing you of just doing it, there's this tendency to treat the technology we have as the only thing we can't change. That's like table stakes. you throw up your hands, you're like, the free market, what are you going to do? But it's not at all. It's, these are intentional systems that were designed by humans. And I'm putting some of the fault. God, this is an original hot take on Facebook. No one blames Facebook for anything bad. But if social media were designed from birth to have a lot of friction in it, if someone said, virality could be really joyful, but virality could also lead to some real problems. And so let's make it really hard for messages to spread to large groups. If they had made that choice long ago, I think the world would be better in lots of ways. And one way would be better is the Clearview scraping strategy wouldn't work. And so, yeah, I think on the one hand, I'm saying these were all out of Clearview's hands, but because it's such a big part of a lot of problems I see as interrelated, I'm not willing to just throw up my hand and say, that's the world we were dealt, and Clearview is just taking advantage of it. I wouldn't mind clamping down on bad researchers, which again, I totally concede is a problematic concept. Right. Yeah. Or a difficult concept, I should say.
Yeah, it's hard to identify and hard to construct and then hard to identify. Okay, we're running a little tight on time, but there are two questions that I think are kind of related, so I'm going to try to ask them together. So Jen King asks about whether or not we can prohibit for-profit scraping, as in the Clearview case, or whether this could be fodder for an unfairness enforcement action. And then there's another set of questions about the FTC's recent ANPR. And the question is, what kinds of friction do you think could empower regulatory innovation? And what should we do about friction and algorithmic harms and commercial surveillance? And also, given your own experience at the FTC, maybe you want to say a little bit about the FTC's authority here and the relationship between the FTC's unfairness authority, scraping, and friction.
Yeah, and it's been long enough since I worked at the FTC that I don't need to provide a disclaimer about the FTC. This is an opportunity to thank the Lord that Alvaro Bedoya was confirmed, my former colleague at Georgetown, and I think the one commissioner of the current 5 who has thought about privacy for more than a decade and in a super deep and nuanced way. And so I have high hopes that his arrival means that the FTC is going to start punching way above its weight when it comes to privacy questions. And hi, Jen King. It's thank you for logging into this. It's great to hear from you. Absolutely, unfairness is a really powerful tool that the FTC has not done quite enough with, although recently they've been doing more. For those who aren't initiated into the depths of unfairness is, don't cite this. This is a really casual summary, but it's don't do things that cause users harm. And one of the big existential fights at the heart of the FTC, and in fact, it's all about friction. So this is, I'm gonna cheat and answer all 3 of the questions the same way. Is how do you define harm, right? I mean, it's core, it's key to their statutory power. And in the 80s, the Federal Trade Commission, under the influence of a lot of kind of unreconstructed Chicago school economists, said, probably it's monetary. Like if it probably has to hit the pocketbook of the consumer or it's not harmful. And then they enshrined that in a policy statement, which is really hard to kind of undo. And then Congress sort of baked this into the statute after that. And so, the thinking until recently was, well, unfairness really is about your pocketbook. There's some exceptions. But there's a whole kind of 2 decades of writing about the harms of privacy that are not measurable in dollars and cents. And so one thing I like about friction, one thing I like about the title, Desirable Inefficiency, is it sort of a disciplinary declaration of freedom. It's saying, hey, economists, here are some philosophers you probably don't think much about, and here are some sociologists who you don't think much about, and they think about harm and they think about questions like unfairness maybe a little bit differently than you do. And I'm being totally uncharitable to economists generally, but the sort of economists that still have a lot of sway in DC are these unreconstructed Chicago school economists who think of mostly dollars and cents. And so, I feel like I'm being super long-winded, so let me try and end this answer crisply. if we could like abandon the policy statement, if we could say, in today's world, there are tons of information harms that have very little to do with dollars and cents, or not principally we worry about because of dollars and cents. And some of them are privacy related, some of them are speech and democracy related. And if the FTC used its meager resources, so we should give more money to the FTC to kind of go after novel theories of unfairness, like Clearview scraping activities, I'd be all for it. I think it'd be great. And I think it would be kind of a step in the right direction away from this disciplinary stranglehold that economics has right now.
I'm going to turn us back to high theory in response to your answer just now, and I think a little bit this builds a bit on Brandy's other question on sort of how we differentiate good researchers from bad research, which is, so I'm with you, right? The reconstructed Chicago School economists' narrow vision of what's good and bad is wildly under-inclusive. What's the right way, right? How do we know whether or not a particular system design, a particular instantiation of friction, if that's what it is pro-democracy, is democracy enhancing or democracy undermining? Right? Depending on what year it was, you might have different answers about Twitter or Facebook, so whether it's democracy enhancing or democracy undermining. How do we know?
Yeah, I mean, I think for one thing, we shouldn't be afraid to experiment before we know, and you know, that gets into really tricky territory about, you know, the power of the government and where it should end. But I refuse to think that the only answer is, well, our job is to react. Our job, meaning we the people, right? Yeah. Our governance is to react and to let things like the free market, they get the opening bid, and the best thing we can do is try and fix the problems. Right. I think that I would like, and I think in some ways European law is beginning to take this shape. I think we should begin to think of ourselves as code designers who get to decide which of these harms we care about and which we don't. Right. Yeah. And you know, and whether or not it's based on an economic theory or, you know, a theory that's steeped in some particular, you know, branch of moral philosophy, is something that should at least be on the table, right? There's a Bureau of Economics at the FTC and the FCC. There's not a Bureau of Philosophy, as far as I know. I haven't checked in the last week.
No.
But we should be able to do that. And when the philosophers or when the sociologists say there is another way to describe harm, and it's super rigorous and it's delineated, but it may be hard to measure, that maybe it's appropriate to use that as a rubric for saying, you know what, you've got to redesign that system. Like, that system is veering into dangerous territory. And we're going to make you do that redesign before we're 100% certain that we've got, you know, to use the economist's phrase, the costs and benefits just right. That because there is democratic input into the design, maybe that alone is what makes it better, even if we can't run the A/B test to see if it's really going to make the world measurably better in some way, right? Just having it, the participation alone, may be all we need to assure ourselves that it's the better path.
Yeah. Yes, I am with you on the value of participatory democracy and participatory processes in rulemaking and legislation. Okay, we have time for, Rachel tells me we have time for one last question. I had prepped one ahead of time, so I'm going to ask this question, though I think we've touched on parts of it. Yep. So the question is, looking beyond scraping, where else do you see friction playing a greater role in the design of technology and the future of technology regulation? Now, you've certainly talked about some examples, encryption being one, but this is your chance to talk about anything you want to besides scraping, but still friction.
Yeah, and again, this very much is my research project, right? I mean, who knows? Maybe someday I'll write my first book about friction, right? I always come up with titles before I come up with articles and books, but like frictive technologies or something like that. So to end not on an abstract thought, but let me just give you a concrete one, which is, I've already teed up a little bit, is virality, right? Like, I think that a lot of the problems of the world stem indirectly, I'm not saying it's the root cause, but stem indirectly from the amplification of kind of hateful, destructive, untrue things that are encouraged because of the business model of social media companies. And none of that's original to me, and none of that's news, right? And so I've been beginning to study the companies, again, without any government pressure, putting friction in. So the two examples that are talked about all the time is WhatsApp now makes it really difficult to share something more than 5 times. They've just added this layer of friction. They started with a test in India, but I think it's gone global. And they, at least from some of the early research I've seen, have said, A, this has really tamped down on the viral spread of messages generally. B, it's tamped down especially on some destructive forms of virality, which is wonderful. The other example, which is such a elegant tweak, I'm so mad I didn't think of it first, is what Twitter started to do when you retweet a tweet that has a link to a web page. Sometimes they'll say, hey, do you want to click that link before you retweet and say something about it? Which is just brilliant, right? Like that moment of enforced human reflection is something that, again, I haven't studied it. I don't know if it actually matters, but I wish that some government regulator had thought of it first. And I wish that that would have been a test case for, should the government be doing things like this? Because I think the answer is clearly yes. And I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with me. And so I'm one of these people who think that the state of social media has really become super problematic for even reasons we haven't talked about. And so thinking of government interventions to not only tamp down on virality, but also tamp down on the kind of business model that led to the virality is a place where I would love more intervention and where I think friction could play a pretty active role.
Mm-hmm. All right. I have plenty of more questions, but no more time. So I am sorry that we have to save them for another time. Paul, thank you so much for chatting with me. And I'm going to hand it back to Rachel.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Tejas. And yes, thank you, Paul, once again for this fantastic discussion. Very much appreciate you bringing this unique lens of yours to the set of issues that we've been discussing over the past several months. I am going to quickly share my screen. I would like to give some acknowledgements to our various CLTC supporters, our community partners, foundation partners, as well as our industry supporters who help us to put events like this on, make this work possible. I'd also like to share a few ways that you can keep in touch with CLTC and our panelists. I know we weren't able to get to everyone's questions today, so we have some email addresses, Twitter handles, where you can contact folks directly and keep the conversation going. We also have some contact info for CLTC at the bottom of the screen. We encourage you to follow us on Twitter, head to our website, and sign up for our newsletter, where you can keep posted on the latest news, research, and events coming out of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. So I will go ahead and leave this slide up for a minute or two as folks are jotting this down. Thank you again, Paul. Thank you, Tejas, and thank you to our audience for joining us today and asking some really thoughtful questions. We look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, take care.
Thank you.